So for those of you who are maybe new to the Jewish Women's Archive or haven't come to any of our programs in a while, I just want to say a little bit about our work and our theory of change and the work that we do here. So the work of the archive is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire really people of all genders to be agents of change through these historical stories and through these role models. And educators are our essential partners in making that happen. You all are the people who are doing this work in your communities, and we certainly wouldn't be able to do it without you. Our work, especially in education, really happens at this meeting point of history and the student or learner's contemporary experience. Thinking about this idea that you cannot be what you cannot see, which is actually a phrase that was coined by Marian Wright Edelman, who was the founder of the Children's Defense League. Children's Defense Fund, one of those. And this sort of idea that we have to be introduced and we have to learn from people and experiences and events and reflections and perspectives that have come before us, and then take those lessons and apply them to our lives. So we're going to be looking today at oral history, which is one way to do that. But there are many other ways to engage students with stories from history and with perspectives and voices from all different pieces of the American Jewish narrative, especially those voices that have traditionally been left out of that story. So if you're interested in learning more about how to do that, I encourage you to come to some of our future online learning programs and explore our resources online. So now we're going to take two short polls. I'm going to pull them up here, and I'd like you to answer both of the polls. So one is a question about what you're hoping to learn today on the left, and then another is a question about whether or not you currently use interview as a teaching tool or education tool in your community. So go ahead, and I'll just give a moment of silence for you all to fill those out. Okay, so as people are writing in, hoping to get step-by-step plan or tips on how to implement an oral history program or project, and working with 7th grade. So hopefully we will cover some of that, and also there will be some conversation towards the end of the program about different creative ways for you to bring this into your classroom and to sort of ask some questions around that. So that's great. Anyone else? Thoughts about what you're hoping to learn or take away from this program? Great. Other ways to, or ideas to encourage oral history projects. So thinking about other places that this could come into the communities that we serve. Okay. And also looking for ways to help participants not in a classroom setting connect to history and identity. Okay, well, we can definitely talk about all of those things today and continue that conversation after the program. So it looks like some of you use interview, most of you use interview in some way or another in your classroom or in your community. So as we are continuing through this program, I encourage those of you who have done this before to share your expertise. Great. So I'm going to close these out now. And first, we're going to just talk a little bit about oral history. So one thing that I think is really interesting is that in sort of what's going on in the world, and especially in the United States, there is this sort of pendulum swing towards or growing popular interest in storytelling, story collecting, and story sharing. So we see that with organizations like StoryCorps or programs like The Moth. And You Shall Tell is a small oral history project based in New York, specifically focused on the Jewish community. And then after the Boston Marathon bombings, there was a project that popped up here, both collecting oral history and testimony from people who were there or impacted by the event as well. That project was accompanied by a digital collecting project where people submitted written stories, photographs, audio, and artifacts, not just, in fact, mostly not of the bombing, but of the sort of the experiences around that and the year after that. So it's interesting to think about the different ways oral history might come into our communities and the different sort of models it could take. And at JWA, we come to oral history from a few different angles, especially because our work is in adding women's stories to the historical record. And those are stories that traditionally haven't been written down or preserved. So the only way to get them is to go and ask for them. So we've done a series of different oral history projects over the years, weaving women's words and women who dared, both focused on women who were leaders or trailblazers in their communities in some way. And then after Hurricane Katrina, we also did, similarly to our marathon project, a series of oral histories as well as a digital collecting project around the impact of Hurricane Katrina on Jewish life in New Orleans and also in other places in the Delta. And oral history, I think, is a really important tool for helping to shape and craft this narrative. It's a way to document personal and private experiences and take those specific experiences and put them into this sort of larger narrative that we have of history, connecting individual experience with events that sometimes feel really big or feel somewhat unrelatable, especially to students who weren't alive during those time periods. And it's also really important because it gives a voice to the experiences of people who have been, for various reasons, left out of the historical narrative that we mostly tell or learn, especially in traditional settings. So other examples of this, in addition to collecting women's stories, are oral histories collected of ex-slaves, former slaves in the 1930s, the stories of Holocaust survivors, which I'm sure many of you have seen and heard, and also of people who are on sort of the margins of history or who haven't been in positions of power. Any questions so far about what oral history is or what it does? So at any point during the program, feel free to raise your hand or type in with some questions and we can definitely answer them. So now I'm going to sort of kick a question out to you all. So feel free to jump in either with your audio or to type into the chat. But I'm wondering what oral history can offer to us as educators and to our students. So thoughts about why we would use this as a tool in our classrooms or communities. So Ronnie is writing in saying, this is a way to extend the learning outside of the classroom and bring relevant subject matter into the classroom. Absolutely. So thinking about how do we learn with the resources that are available in our community and how do we expand the resources that we might traditionally use in our classroom to include more perspectives and more voices. I see a couple other people are typing in. Becky is saying, also a way to bring Jewish values of storytelling and narrative into the world. So yeah, there is a tradition of oral history, of storytelling, of being in community and sharing our stories in that way. And oral history is one way to sort of continue that tradition. And I appreciate that connection, which feels very rooted in Judaism. And sometimes we're looking for ways that don't feel overly burdensome in terms of being traditional, but are accessible to people, but are rooted in that tradition. So that's great. Also a way to make topics more tangible for students. A person's story is more interesting than reading a textbook. Absolutely. And students get to ask the questions and follow their own curiosity. And teaching skills for connecting to each other and learning about each other. All of this is great. And I see Jana is typing in, so I'll just wait one more second to hear what you have to say. Great. So, and also, I love that phrase, telling history from the ground up, right? We're going from the personal experience to the collective experience rather than what our students are often learning in school, which is learning about the collective experience with maybe one or two stories of the personal experience. Excellent. So at JWA, we like, and some of this will sound familiar based on your ideas, but we talk about oral history fostering four specific areas of student learning. So one is this idea that it is emergent, that students get to follow their own curiosity, ask questions about what's important to them, decide on the topics of their interviews based on what they're interested in, and that they really use their own motivation, their interest, and their relationship with whoever is being interviewed to drive their inquiry, analysis, and synthesis through the process of doing an oral history. Also, skill building. So the obvious one is active listening, right? And learning how to do that. But it's also about developing strong questions, doing some writing and research, doing a little bit of analysis and saying, okay, looking critically at the stories that are being told and figuring out how does all of that fit together, and then figuring out how to tell that story to somebody else. And then there are also these areas of emotional health and growth. So looking at how storytelling impacts students emotionally and in their relationships. So one thing that I have learned in doing this work is I've done some research about the impact of sharing family and community stories. And there was actually a really interesting study done in 2010 out of Emory by these two researchers, Marshall Duke and Robin Fibish, who were looking at mostly dinner conversations and opportunities where families shared stories, specifically older family members shared stories about their lives with younger family members. And what they found is that in families that had more sharing, and in families where students or kids learned about how their relatives struggled and overcame obstacles and changes in their lives, those kids had higher self-esteem, they had a greater sense of control over their lives, they were better able to problem solve when things changed, and really learned from those life lessons and were able to apply them to their own lives. And there was an interesting article last spring in the New York Times that also talked about how story and constructing story and both individual and collective narrative is increasingly important for groups. So Jews are a group, your community is a group, whether it's a school or a synagogue or a locally based Jewish community. Within that community, there are different groups. And together, we're all trying to shape some part of our identity that is collective. And using story, whether it's in this article, it talks about how businesses use it to build brand, how the military uses it to build cohesion. And just like those communities, our communities are looking for something that is common and figuring out how to take from the common and build the individual and vice versa. So I think oral history also really helps our students to grow in those ways. When we're talking about oral history, there are sort of three basic components, and depending on your classroom, you might do more or less of the different parts of this project, depending on the age of your students, how often you see them, how much time you're spending on this particular project. So we're going to be spending most of our time today talking about the actual interview process. How do we craft good questions? How do we conduct an interview? That kind of thing. But there's also this piece about connecting the story that you get in the interview with the larger historical narrative and with the world beyond this person's experience. So that requires some research both before and after the interview, usually learning a little bit more about the person, studying a little bit about the historical context for their life or for the period of their life that you're most interested in learning about. And then after the interview, going back to the moments and stories that you gathered in the interview and thinking about, oh, this person was at this event or remembers this thing that happened or had an interaction with this historical person, and going back and doing some more research and saying, okay, what more do I need to know about the context to really understand this person's story more deeply? And then the last piece, which we'll talk a little bit about too, is how do we share these stories, right? Are we going to have our students put together a Tumblr? Are they going to have an online or a sort of online blog where they're going to be writing about what they're learning? Are students going to prepare a museum? Are they going to do an art project? Are they going to a local archive that would be interested in having the transcriptions of these interviews? So there are a lot of different ways to think about how to share and preserve those stories. And ultimately, I think that comes back to our fundamental belief at the Jewish Women's Archive that not only do the stories belong to us collectively, but we have a shared responsibility for making sure that we leave a more complete history for the people that follow us. And oral history, whether we're doing it as adults or we're doing it in our communities or we're doing it with our students, is a fundamental way for doing that and a basic building block of that process. Okay, I've been talking a lot. Any questions so far? Okay, so here are a couple resources, and these links should be clickable. So if you want to click on them and view them in your browser, you can do that while I'm talking. I'm not going to walk us through these too much, but we have a couple different resources on our site for collecting oral histories, and these are really like tachlis, instructional, practical resources. So the In Our Own Voices guide, which is available completely on Google Books, or I think you can still order a print copy from us, but the whole thing is available online, has tons of question sets, essays about context and different topic areas, sample permission forms, pre-interview questionnaire forms, tons and tons of resources that you can use if you're doing a project like this. The Family History Toolkit, that's a different thing. The Family History Toolkit is an adaptation of In Our Own Voices for a younger crowd. Right now, it's written using female gendered language because we created it for our website, My Bat Mitzvah Story. I imagine by spring or summer, we'll have a gender neutral version of that will be available to everyone. But the language there is a little bit more age appropriate, and it's significantly pared down. It doesn't have as much in it. And it's all available on the website. And then we also have a lesson plan on My Bat Mitzvah Story that will lead you as educators through the process of creating some sort of museum or display or exhibit out of oral history and history collecting projects. So that sort of walks you step by step through the different components of that, and will help you time that process out a little bit more. And Ronnie's writing in saying she's using the Museum of Family History lesson plans now. So you can let us know how that's going, and we'd love to hear from you about that. So now I want to get into the instructional part, and there will be opportunities for you all to participate a lot in the next, I would say, 15 minutes of this program. So we're going to do that as best as we can, given that we're online. So in oral history, in an interview, we talk about there are two roles that are being filled. So can anyone say what those two roles are? Yeah, so Ronnie's coming in, the questioner and the sharer. So yes, there are two roles. These two people, one person is asking questions and one person is telling the story. B is writing in saying the interviewer and the narrator. So that's exactly right. Both of you were right. The language that we use around this is the narrator and the interviewer. So the person who's telling the story is the narrator. And the interviewer is the person who's asking questions. And both of them have very specific roles and tasks that they should be doing. And together, in a very beautiful synergy, the interview unfolds through the relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. And the key component or piece, of course, aside from the story being told, and the important role of the interviewer is to ask the right questions that invite the kinds of stories that we want to hear. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little activity, and this is actually an activity that I would recommend you do with your students depending on their age level, but I think this is something that most kids can handle in one way or another. We're going to practice generating some good questions. So we're going to imagine that because we're all Jewish educators, this is something that we can sort of bond over. So if you were interested in learning more about how and why somebody became a Jewish educator, what would you ask? And I'm going to pull up a whiteboard because we're going to need that. Okay, so go ahead, just type those questions right into the chat and keep them coming for the next minute and a half or so. What questions would you ask? Okay, these are great. Okay, keep them. Great. Okay, so finish the question that you're working on now. This is a pretty good list that we have here. Great. Okay, so now we have, you can see that I've sorted these questions. I don't know if you can see, it's really small. I don't know how to adjust the text size, but hopefully you can see. Let me make this bigger. So I've sorted these questions into two categories. So what are the two categories? What do you notice about the two categories of questions that I've put up here? What do you notice about the questions on the left versus the questions on the right? Anyone? Okay, I'll tell you. So the questions on the left have answers that are pretty simple or straightforward. Who were your role models? My fourth grade teacher, my mom. When did you know this was something that interested you? When I had my first teaching job in college. What's the most important thing you want others to be able to learn from you? That being Jewish looks really different depending on who you are, but all of it is good and meaningful. Those have very clear answers. The questions on the right are a little bit more open. They invite more story. So tell me more. How did you prepare for this career? What have you done? Why are you invested in Jewish continuity? What have been the experiences or pieces that have made that important to you? Can you describe your Jewish education? Those stories invite a little bit more. So we call the questions like the kinds of questions that are on the left. I've been practicing this all week. Closed questions. Okay, that kind of worked. And the questions like the ones on the ones on the right are open questions, right? They invite more story. So let me tell you a little bit more. Does that seem clear to people? Great. So when we have these two different types of questions, it allows us to weave and pace our narrative in a way that our questions in a way that helps the narrator construct their story. So questions that start with who, what, when, asking specific pieces are those closed questions, and the open-ended questions ask or allow our narrator to say more, to elaborate on what information they've given us. So if we say, how many brothers and sisters did you have? What was your family like growing up? And then you can say, tell me more about what it was like to grow up in that family. What was your experience like? How did that fit in? So when we switch off between these two questions, we call that the 1-2 punch method. So if we start by asking a closed question and then we follow up with an open question that allows our narrator to expand on what they've learned, not what they've learned, but what their experience has been, it allows the narrator to think through something. A lot of times our narrator is processing this really for the first time with us. People aren't always asked to share their stories. So a lot of times we need to guide them through that process, and switching off between open and closed-ended questions, closed being somewhat easier to answer, allows our narrator to construct that story in a way that feels sort of not linear, but connected. Also, when thinking about drafting good questions, we want to make sure that we have extra questions. Usually you don't get to all the questions, but sometimes your narrator might move on from a topic or subject more quickly than you were expecting. And having some other questions or additional questions to get at the details and the really meaty pieces of those experiences is really important. And also to make sure that we're listening to the narrator and sort of picking up on their cues. If a narrator doesn't want to share a particular part of their experience, then we need to respect that as the interviewer. And we shouldn't push them too much, and we should move on to something different. Likewise, sometimes a narrator really wants to talk about one thing. And in that case, we should follow their lead and try to probe a little bit more about why that thing or that idea or that experience was so important to them. And by following that lead, we can begin to understand a little bit more about their experience, the way that they experienced it, rather than through the lens that we're sort of projecting, being the interviewers driving the interview. What questions do we have about this idea of good questions and the 1-2 punch method? Questions or concerns about this? Does it make sense? Great. Great. So, and I think also one of the things that I appreciate about this structure for oral history interviews is that it's actually really easy to teach to our students and allow them to develop those questions independently. And then we have a really clear evaluation tool of, did our students get it? Can my student write an open-ended and a closed-ended question? Can they understand what kinds of questions will invite more story that relate to the closed question that they've asked? So in this part of the project, it really gives us a clear tool to understand whether or not our students are getting what we're trying to share with them. And when they go and employ this in their interviews, it will definitely give them a much richer product than if they weren't following this recipe for success. Great. So now I want to model a little bit another activity that I usually do when I'm teaching how to interview. I think this is always fun with adults, and I'm sure it would be especially fun with kids. So basically what I do is I come up with a list of things that you shouldn't do in an interview, and I ask learners to role play that in front of the group. So instead of just giving them a list and saying, here's what you shouldn't do, we have the opportunity to see what that looks like. So I write down each of the different things not to do on a little note card or print it out on a piece of paper. And I have two kids come up and or two people come up, and I give one of them the role of the interviewer, and they have a specific task. And the role of the narrator is always to answer the questions as best as you can. It always has the same directive. So what we're going to do is role playing can be a little bit tricky online. But I do have some video clips of a workshop that I did a while back with some other educators. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch the video clips. They're very short. And as you're watching and right after, I want you to type in and say, what is the interviewer doing that they shouldn't be doing? The audio isn't totally great, so I included subtitles, so hopefully it works wonderfully. So let me go ahead and pull up the first one. Okay, so here we go. Here's the first one. Get ready.
Oh my gosh, I love blueberries. Oh my gosh, I love blueberries. I love blueberries in pie. I love blueberries in cakes. And I love to do artistic things. What do you think?
I don't like blueberries.
What about watermelon? I like watermelon when you cut it up in like a cool little thing, and I like watermelon when you like have it as a snack, and I love it after a hot day. Do you like watermelon?
Well, my daughter likes watermelon a lot, but I have to make sure I get it without the seeds, otherwise she doesn't like it. So watermelon, I mean, I like it, but like my daughter really likes it. She's the one who found it.
Well, did you ever hear that story about the girl who swallowed the watermelon seed and like it planted, and then this watermelon grew? I was always afraid of watermelon when I was a kid.
Okay, so in case it wasn't clear, the interviewer is the person on the right and the narrator is the person on the left. So what is the person on the right doing wrong in this situation? Great, so the interviewer isn't asking specific questions about the narrator. Yep. Energy level is mismatched. Okay, good. I really like that. There's too much talking. The interviewer is doing too much talking. And also that the interviewer has taken over. So yes, all of these are the right answers. So the problem here is that the narrator is talking too much about themselves, or the interviewer is talking too much about themselves. They're supposed to be asking questions. An interview is not a conversation. It's not, two people coming as equals learning about each other. The interviewer's job is to get the narrator's story, to invite that story, and to make the narrator feel comfortable sharing their story. So and this is really hard. This is hard for almost everyone, to make sure that you're really respecting that role of interviewer and the responsibility that comes with that. A couple other things that came up that don't always come up with this video. Ronnie, I love that you said the energy level is mismatched. So we do want to think about how we are coming across to our narrator and making sure that we're inviting them and making them feel comfortable. So if their energy is really low, it's good for us to be upbeat and welcoming, but not too energetic. And if it seems like they're feeling a little, reserved, we don't want to be drilling them with questions. We want to be making it comfortable and easy for them to participate. Okay, so now, okay, so people are writing in saying that they could hear but not see the video. Some people could see but not hear. Okay, that's not great. I'm not sure why that is. There will be a survey at the end of this, and in the survey, if you could put that, we will make sure that we problem solve it for next time. So, so do we want to try another video, or do we want to just move on to the next thing, given that everyone's having problems? Okay. Okay, great. We'll try another one. This time I'll also try something else to see if the audio will work. So here is our second video. I have a question for those of you that can't see the video. Can you see the pod that's supposed to hold the video? Like, do you see the container? Okay, you do. Okay, this is an ongoing challenge. We've been troubleshooting all week and we thought we fixed it. So we will follow up with you about why you can't see the video after the call. Okay, so here is the second one.
So,
Come on.
how did you spend the 4th of July this year?
I was traveling.
And did you stop and have any food? Special food for July 4th?
Not really.
Uh-huh. What did you eat? You had to eat something on July 4th.
Well, we had to stop at a McDonald's.
Oh, wow. McDonald's, really?
Yeah.
What did you eat? Seems so unhealthy.
Well, you know, we got the kids some french fries.
Oh, wow.
Okay, great. So ironically, I couldn't see the video that time, so I'm glad you guys could see it. Great, so some comments coming in. One, the interviewer is passing a lot of judgment. She said, "Oh, really? You went to McDonald's? Ah." Missy commenting, she's asking closed questions, right? Her first one is, how did you spend 4th of July? And then she said, well, you had to do something, right? So she's asking maybe too specific of questions, or the narrator didn't want to talk about those things. The questions weren't compelling. Yes, now part of that is just this is a very constructed role play here, so we didn't give her a lot of guidance about that. But I think you guys are raising a lot of the right points. So our questions should be open-ended. We should be switching off and on between open and closed-ended questions. Also, when we're interviewing, we want to make sure that we're not passing judgment on the stories of our narrators, right? We are a neutral party. We are there for them to collect their story, to understand their experience, not to project our own judgment onto that. And that can be hard in more ways than one. I think it's easy for most people to not say, wow, that sounds awful, or you shouldn't have done that, right? But it's less easy to say, oh, you must have been really sad, or wow, I bet you were excited, or even saying things like, yeah, uh-huh. All of those things, whether we're affirming, anytime that we're passing any judgment, that's not our place as the interviewer. As the interviewer, our role is to ask questions and understand this person's experience. So sometimes if you find yourself wanting to make some of those comments, use that as an opportunity to say, is there a question that I could ask to help me understand this a little bit better? So if I wonder if this person feels sad, I could say, how did you feel in that situation? And then I'm getting to a question that allows them to say what they're feeling without me passing my lens or judgment onto it. Abra's also writing in, saying, you would never stand across from each other like this for an interview. So that's very true. I'm glad you brought that up, because another important thing about interviews is making sure that you have the right space to do it, right? You're going to be doing this probably for at least a half hour, in some cases maybe an hour. You want to have a quiet place where the phone isn't going to ring, where you're not going to be interrupted by other people, where there's not a lot of background noise like the fridge going on and off, and a place that's comfortable for both people, where you can have a relaxed, amicable back and forth. That's a great point, Abra. Okay, let's try one more and see what happens. I'm so excited to know. So here is the third video. Let me just make it a little bit bigger. This one's a little bit harder to hear, so we'll see what happens.
I want to ask you, in terms of the July 4th celebrations, do you get together with a lot of family, or is it friends? And what type of celebration do you do? You know, like a huge gathering,
Okay, well, let me see if I can put them in order.
Okay, that was a quick one. So Missy's saying she asked a lot of questions really fast, and too many, one right after the other. It's too confusing. This is exactly right. Especially if we are excited about the story that our narrator is telling, it's easy to start asking those questions. And we have to remember our narrator is trying to answer our questions, right? So we have to support them in doing that. So asking too many questions at once makes it very difficult for the narrator to construct that story. And so we want to make sure that we're pacing them out. We're asking one question at a time and we're pausing. Even if it sounds a little bit burdensome, or even if you ask a question and then there's a silence after that, allow yourself to sort of sit in that silence and sit in that space and allow your narrator to put their story together. As I said before, for a lot of people, this is the first time that they've told their story in this way. They're having their own realizations and experiences as the interview is happening. And you want to be able to invite that, witness it, and record it as much as possible. So we want to set our narrator up for success as they're sharing that story. Great. So we hide this. So when we're thinking about what not to do, we covered a lot of these already. So another thing I'll just highlight, we don't want to interrupt the narrator or cut them off, and that includes asking another question, but can also include some of those verbal affirmations that we were talking about. Yeah, wow. Instead, use nonverbal communication to show that you're listening, to show you understand what they're saying. So you don't have to sit there with a smile on your face the whole time, but if they're telling a story that's sad or funny, or it seems difficult for them to listen, use your nonverbal communication, lean in, smile, use your eyebrows to express concern. And that way you'll be protecting them and they'll feel comfortable sharing their stories with you. So these are sort of the big ones. I think both of the oral history guides include lists of these things if you want to create your own role play. And it's also great to have, after people have done some interviews, to have them come back and share a little bit about how it went, what they learned, what they did that maybe they shouldn't have done, and give your students an opportunity to reflect on that experience together on the actual process of collecting. I'm not going to say too much about these resources because I want us to get to a short conversation, but we have these other resources for collecting and sharing stories, not from the Jewish Women's Archive, that I think are really strong. So Thanksgiving is coming up at the end of the month. The day after Thanksgiving is the National Day of Listening, and StoryCorps has a great resource guide around that. When people are together with family around holidays, it's a really wonderful time to gather some of these stories. And the Contemporary Jewish Museum also has some great resources, not just about how to do oral history, but also how to use technology to share those projects and the stories that you collect. In addition to collecting oral history, the histories in and of themselves become resources that we can use in our teaching. So in addition to the audio and video oral histories and clips that we have available on JWA and on our YouTube channel, StoryCorps, the Shoah Foundation have wonderful collections of this, as do many other places, I'm sure. And then there's also this resource called This I Believe, which isn't oral history per se, but it's people reading aloud essays they've written about their beliefs, ethics, morality, and things that happened in their lives that helped them understand what they believe. And I think that those could be really compelling, not necessarily Jewish resources, but things that can help our students answer some of those questions about ethics. So yeah, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So now in our last 10 or 12 minutes, I have a couple, I have another video which may or may not work, and a slide that are case studies of people who have done this in the field. But before we move to those, I just want to throw out the opportunity for those of you who have questions or ideas about how to do this that you might want to share or discuss with the group. Now is the time to do that. So what didn't we cover here that you want to know more about? What ideas do you have for using this going forward? And feel free to use your mic or the chat. Okay, so Abra is writing in saying she's curious about the youngest students who could do this. So I think I have heard of people doing some story collecting with kids who are in preschool. Now, the way that they did this was their unit was about the Shema, and they had one question that the students were asking. And the students had the help of a parent to do the audio recording, but the student did the asking. And it was something like, what do you think of when you think of the Shema, or something like that. So, I think that students, even from a very young age, can do story collecting. The oral history project that we're talking about sort of on a larger scale here obviously requires someone who is a little bit further developmentally, but I think if you frame it, students of any age could do this. Ronnie is asking, are there resources for how to teach children to form questions? So that's a great question. The Family History Toolkit has some resources around that, and this little activity that I just showed you on asking good questions can be a great entry point into that. I'm glad to look around, and also if you find any additional resources, I'm sure they exist. I would love for you to share them on our Facebook group or send them to me in an email and we can kick them out to everybody. Janet, I'd love for you to say a little bit more about the lesson that you have in negotiating memory versus history. Oh, your mic isn't working. Okay, why don't you type that in and I'll go to the next one. So, and B is saying, we're a historical society and would like ideas for creative ways to utilize oral histories we collect and encourage the collecting and sharing of them. Great. So we have, I have a couple examples of interesting ways that people have shared, and feel free, you all, to type in your ideas for how to use the oral histories. I think there could be some interesting programs done around scavenger hunts, or having people match different experiences or different pieces of oral histories with each other to try to construct a narrative together if they're pieces you've already collected. Several people that we have worked with have done artistic representations of people's stories and then done gallery walks and exhibits and presentations around that. I think you could do some really cool playwriting using oral histories. So those are some ideas, and I think if you want to jump onto our Facebook group, I see Miriam put the link there, and kick your question B out to the educators that we have across the country. I'm sure that they would have some excellent ideas as well. Okay, so Ronnie's saying that she's having trouble getting students to form their own questions. Does anyone have other ideas about how to help our students ask better questions? And I see Janet is still writing in. I think another thing, Ronnie, that we probably, great. Okay, so Ronnie's posted a link to a site with some games. I think another thing that could be a really good tool, Ronnie, is for you to do some role playing in fishbowl style. So having two kids come up and role play, and then having the kids in the circle critique them. And this is more than like you're handing them something and telling them what to do, but you're actually having them develop some questions and interview each other in front of the group, and then analyze how that went. And I think that that's a really good way for students to learn, because they get some critique on their work, and also all of the students get to participate in some way. Okay, so Janet is talking about the importance of having that historical context, given that memory and people's memory is very subjective and changes. We know that. And I think that that's really true. And interviewing and collecting interviews for their own sake is a wonderful experience, and as is important. But from a historical perspective, that context piece is really, really important. And also taking, especially in a situation like you're in, Janet, you have oral histories of people who are from the same communities, perhaps living from the same time period. So one thing that's really great is you can put those next to each other and say, how do these people remember their experiences in a similar way, and what things are different? And we always want to do that when we're using historical sources. We always want to bring in other perspectives, other voices, and context for that time to say, what can we learn from this? And also, what maybe isn't captured here? What more do we know? Can we confirm that this is in fact true? And sort of grappling with the subjectivity of truth, especially when we're collecting it off sometimes 50 or 60 years after it happened. Great, yeah. So before we sign off, are you all interested in just seeing 2 examples of how other people have done or shared oral history projects in their communities? Okay, great. So, and I will say that both of these were done with high school age students, and one was done in a supplemental school and one was done in a day school. But I think you could easily do a version of these projects with younger students. So the first example is from an ed director in San Diego named Susan, and she actually brought not girls, just girls from her school, but girls from all of the different Jewish faith institutions in the city together cross-denominationally, and had them interview women from the community. And then they had so they met over the course of the year, I think 4 or 5 times. They learned about each other, they learned how to do oral history interviews, and then they went and collected them. And then they had a big party at the end, and all of their communities came together, shared the stories of these women. And here you can see, this is one of the girls who participated writing about what she learned from the project, which really speaks to some of the pieces that we had been talking about earlier about sort of why this is such a wonderful teaching tool. And then the second example, and I think that it was really straightforward. I think that they really just sort of talked about the person and what they learned, and all of the women that were interviewed were actually there. So that was really great. And one thing that I'll say that Susan told me when I was talking to her about this project was, she said that one thing that surprised them was they had planned for the girls to share these stories, and unexpectedly the women who had been interviewed wanted to say something about that experience at the celebration that they were having. And actually that was one of the most powerful moments of the night, was having these women share about what it was like to be interviewed. So I encourage you to think about creating some sort of sharing experience that allows students to reflect, and also that allows the participants to hear how impactful it was for them, and also for people in the broader community. If it's a project that you want to continue, sometimes hearing those stories will make other people excited about doing this kind of project. Ronnie's asking a question about interviewing parents versus grandparents. I think it all depends on what your goals are. A lot of people I often encourage people to use interview as a way to talk about ritual and changes in ritual practice. I think questions about gender, learning experience, professional career, I think all of those things change from generation to generation. So I think you really have to think about what your goals are and what you're really hoping your students will do, and that's how you decide who and how much to focus the people that they're interviewing. I hope that answers your question. So the second idea is we have a short video. It's about 4 minutes. So if you can't see it, let me know. And I can email you the link to it instead, and we won't watch it here. But there is a video here from Barbara Rosenblit, who is a Judaics teacher in Atlanta, and she and the art teacher at the Weber School where she works do this project every year where students spend a whole semester in this interdisciplinary class doing the interviews and creating these art projects, like huge art pieces around the woman's story. In the past, they've done shadow boxes and hats, and the year that this video is made, they made these giant dresses representing each woman's story, and they called it Addressing Women's Lives. So we're going to play this, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
We were inspired to do this class by the Jewish Women's Archive. We thought, what if we actually captured the lives of women close by? If you think kids are desperately interested in their family history, you're wrong. But we were determined to offer this course to kids this age and make them understand where they were coming from, and then launch them to where they're going to. Where do you meet these women? The center very kindly arranged for us to be able to have our exhibit there in honor of women's history. Ruby! This is Ruby. She's one of the honored women in the portraits. She is. The exhibit begins here, just so you know.
Anna made this wonderful dress, and these are all my family pictures.
Oh, good. Sheila's doing the repair. Now, do y'all know each other? Sheila Miller. She leads the kids through the art part. We've been working together about 15 years. I think there are about 90 women who have been honored.
We're almost up to 100.
Yeah.
I interviewed my great-grandma. We always have Shabbat with her, but I've never really learned all about her childhood and stuff.
I'm 82. I'm proud of all my years, and I hope I can tell you someday I'm 92.
I hope so too.
Why older women, you know, their lives are richer. And they span often a century of events which these kids who are 17 years old read about. And to have someone talk about the USO during World War II, or integration, and what it was like in the city of Atlanta in 1955.
We take an oral history, and by making it visual, you really get to share it with a larger audience.
If she just gave us a canvas and told us to draw something, I have no idea what I would have drawn. Like this, you have something you can work with.
We have next to each picture a short biography of the woman whose life has been distilled into the form of a dress. And we have the artist statement about why they made the specific artistic choices that they made. And reading those brings the work to life.
And what he wrote about me, I had no idea he was listening to me. What he picked up about me that I never said no to an adventure.
I think that really inspired them to look at the dress, because, it's a little daunting, especially for the males in the class, to think that they're going to be painting a dress.
Well, this is actually a dress that I had a similar one when I was young.
This is Anne. She was born in Vilna. The dress is actually modeled after this dress that she's wearing in this picture, which is just after she was liberated.
I lost everybody. I was left all by myself. I was a young girl. I was a little younger than him. That's me in a Red Cross uniform. Right there.
My great-grandma, she lived in a town where there were very, very few Jews. And actually the KKK burnt a cross in her front yard. So that's why I did for the newspaper.
There's a little bit of the artists who did the canvases in every one of these pieces. So it's kind of like two ideas merging together, the women's lives, but also the young artist that creates the work.
I thought you caught the spirit of Mrs. Gilmer. So this is my girl. You love me, I love you. I love you, darling.
Both of my grandmothers had passed away when I was young. I didn't get the chance to really hear about that and that whole generation.
I was born in 1914. Today is my 95th birthday.
These pictures don't reveal age. They are young, they're vital. The kids in this interview have managed somehow to have found the essence of that person, and that's what strikes me about these dresses. Bye. Y'all be good?
Great teacher. Great teacher.
She's actually an amazing teacher. In the classroom, she's lively, she's I don't know, she really like puts her all into her teaching, and she loves what she does. You can just tell.
All right. So, yes, Ronnie, we'll send you the link to the video so that you can have it. It is really amazing. You know, I think the part where the woman says, "I had no idea that he was listening," you know, that this is really a gift in a lot of ways that students can give to the people that they're interviewing. We'll make sure that you all get the link. And I think whether or not you're able to do it at such a large scale, the different components of this project I think are really interesting to think about, because they provide us with a lot of different ways to engage students. So there's an artistic representation of it using primary sources and documents from the people's lives in this case. So they were using photographs and old, you know, copies of old records and things like that in addition just to the story. They also wrote an artist statement, right? That's that reflective piece that we were talking about. Here is what I learned, and here is how I translated what I learned into the piece that you see. And then having a label or written piece that says a little bit, a summary about this person's life. So there are a lot of really wonderful pieces and ways to take this project and to take any oral history project and weave it into your community. So I hope you all take what you have learned here, put it to use in your communities, and then come back and share with us what you've done. If you have other questions, let us know. You'll get an email from us on Monday. Bye. You'll get an email from us on Monday with links to these resources. And